This is the beginning of the topic on abortion, and in this part of it, I'm only discussing a couple of specific questions. Until Professor Kamosi gets here, I'm essentially leaving aside the discussion of the moral status of the fetus, and I'm looking at a specific argument about women's rights and about the Supreme Court's decision in Roe versus Wade and the basis for that. Okay, so we look at what I'm calling the women's rights approach. Sometimes it's called the feminist approach to abortion. Let me say that I'm not asserting that all feminists use this argument or all proponents of women's rights use this argument for abortion, but I think it's commonly associated with that kind of position, and this is a convenient shorthand for it. And this is the central question, whether, you know, as you of course know, in the abortion debate in this country, the two sides describe themselves as pro-choice and pro-life. I think neither of those labels are really very good ones. The pro-life one, well, it's more specific than just being pro-life. But to focus today, what we're talking about, pro-choice, the idea of that label is to suggest that somehow that's enough to decide the issue. That if you're opposed to women being able to have legal abortions, you're against choice, and we should generally believe in choice, and therefore that's a bad position. So it's a label that is chosen to suggest positive connotations. We believe in a free society, we believe people should be able to make choices, and I'm in pro-choice. But the question is whether that idea can itself resolve the abortion issue, can be a sound argument for the legalisation of abortion, at least under some conditions, without even getting into this claim whether the fetus has or does not have a right to life. Because that's, I think, what I'm calling the women's rights argument, you could call it the pro-choice argument, is actually trying to achieve. It's trying to say, here's an argument for why women should be able to have abortions, and I don't really need to discuss that thorny philosophical question of what moral status the embryo or fetus has, because I've got a good argument of a different type. So the question is whether that can succeed, that kind of argument. And the classic, well, I don't know about the classic, the classic philosophical discussion of it anyway, or argument for this representation of it, is in the article by Judith Jarvis Thomson. It's in your reading, A Defence of Abortion, where she is arguing that abortion can be defensible even if the fetus counts as much as a normal human being. That's a very strong claim, because if that were true, if she can make out that claim, then clearly the pro-choice position is sound. If you could justify having an abortion even if the fetus had the same moral status as any mature human being, then you could say, look, I don't need to get into the debate about the moral status of the fetus, because I'm granting you. Let me even grant you, maybe I don't really believe this, but let me grant you for the sake of the argument that the fetus counts just as much, the life of the fetus has the same moral status as your life or your life or your life. And even if I grant you that very strong claim, I can still show you that a woman has a right to an abortion and should not be prevented from having an abortion. So, how does Thomson argue for that? Well, I hope you've read the article. She comes up with one of these bizarre philosophical examples that philosophers like to think up in order to test certain claims. So in order to test the claim whether you can really defend a woman's right to abortion even if the fetus has the same moral status as a normal, mature human being, you say, well, imagine that the relationship between the pregnant woman and the fetus was somehow duplicated in an example where there is a normal adult human being who is dependent on the woman in something like the same way that the fetus is dependent on the pregnant woman. And that's why she then asks you to imagine this little story about how there's a famous violinist who needs to be hooked up to your blood supply, to your circulation for 9 months in order to survive. You're the only person who can help him survive. And so the Society of Music Lovers has kidnapped him and hooked him up to your circulation in that way. Sorry, it has kidnapped you, not him, I guess. And you were drugged, and now you wake up and you find yourself in hospital with the violinist hooked up to your arm in some way, with your blood supplies connected, and you think to yourself, do I have an obligation to stay here for 9 months in order to keep this person alive? Because that's the situation. Explained to you. If you stay here for 9 months, he'll be fine. You can be independent of him. But if you disconnect yourself, he'll die. So that's the moral dilemma that Thompson is putting up in this situation. So there are many questions, of course, you can ask. One is, whenever somebody produces a hypothetical example to illustrate a real-life moral problem, you can say, is this a good analogy? So that's one thing we might ask. So is this like pregnancy in some way? Is disconnecting yourself from the violinist like abortion? Well, obviously one important point is that you never consented to be hooked up to the violinist. So you never consented to get pregnant. You didn't even do anything that had a particularly high risk of getting pregnant. Well, that doesn't seem to usually be the case for pregnancy, but it is the case in one particular circumstance, that is, if a woman is raped and is pregnant as a result of the rape. Then she certainly never consented, and her situation is, to that extent, closer to that of the violinist. So you could defend Thompson's argument by saying, all right, I think the analogy holds. Let's assume the rest of it is a good argument. I haven't discussed that yet. I think the analogy holds and the rest of it is a good argument. But it only holds in cases of rape. It doesn't hold where the pregnancy is not the result of rape. So what could somebody who wants to defend Thompson's position to say to that? They could say, well, suppose that there was a contraceptive failure. Suppose the woman did not want to get pregnant. Perhaps she used normally reliable contraceptives, but it failed. It does occasionally happen. It's rare, but it happens. Is that sort of sufficiently like the case? Well, it's not really like the case where the woman is kidnapped. It's more like the case where a woman made some little mistake. Maybe she didn't even make a mistake, maybe something went wrong in something that was not really within her control. So if, for example, she'd taken a normally highly reliable contraceptive pill, but for some reason it had failed, then you could say she didn't even make a mistake herself, but something went wrong. So let's say maybe she was planning to visit a friend in hospital, was on the 9th floor, she pressed the button for the 9th floor, but the elevator stopped at the 8th floor, which is where the Music Lovers Society was waiting to find somebody to hook up to the violinist. And, they assumed that she was the person, jabbed her in the arm with an anaesthetic to put her to sleep, and she wakes up in this situation. So you might then say, is that the same as the case where she was kidnapped? You could argue, well, yeah, she shouldn't really have to suffer these consequences just because the elevator had a malfunction. And then what if the elevator didn't have a malfunction, but she actually pushed the wrong button? She mistook what floor her friend was on. That's a little bit more, I guess, like being on the contraceptive pill, but forgetting to take it one night, which, if you're really unlucky, I suppose, could lead to you becoming pregnant. So you can push the analogy and you can tweak the story in various ways that does seem to cover other cases, some other cases of pregnancy, but it doesn't seem to cover all of the cases of pregnancy. It doesn't seem to cover cases where a woman knowingly has sex at a time when she is likely to be fertile, not caring whether she gets pregnant or not, but then deciding later on that she doesn't want to be pregnant. Or where maybe even she intentionally gets pregnant, but then breaks up with a boyfriend and decides she doesn't want to go through with the pregnancy anymore. So there'd be other cases where I think it would be difficult to apply this kind of scenario. So maybe if the argument works, it works in a limited range of cases of abortion, and just how limited it is depends on which of these other stories you might think is sufficiently similar for the argument to go through. So that's one issue about the argument. The second, though, is whether in fact we agree with Thompson's judgments about what it would or would not be right to do. So let me again test you on this. Let's start with let's focus on the kidnap case. All right. So think about this situation. This woman has been kidnapped against her will. She wakes up in hospital, connected to the violinist. Let's say that there's a doctor who comes in who's not part of the Society of Music Lovers and says to her, look, I didn't realise when I made this connection that you had not consented to supporting this violinist. That's very unfortunate that you were not fully informed and asked for your consent. And therefore, as an ethical doctor, I'm quite willing to disconnect you if you say so. But you do realise that if you do disconnect yourself, this violinist over here is going to die. I have no possibility of keeping him alive once you've decided to disconnect yourself. So now the choice is yours. So, and actually it's quite important how you now phrase this question I'm going to put, because let me put it this way first. Do you think that the woman ought to remain connected to the violinist in these circumstances? How many of you think she ought to remain connected to the violinist? Okay, a few, only a few. How many of you think that let me try asking in a slightly different way. How many of you think it would be good if the woman remained connected to the violinist? Okay, now we're getting a lot more hands. That's interesting. How many of you, now I'll ask a different question, which maybe will go the other way. How many of you think the woman has a right to disconnect herself from the violinist? I think one of the striking things that Judith Jarvis Thomson says in her defence is this remark about Henry Fonda. It shows the article is getting a little bit dated. You know, no doubt it would be Brad Pitt or someone if you did it today, or whoever. Maybe even that's getting dated, I don't know. But anyway, so great movie star, and Thomson is saying, suppose I'm sick and the only thing that will save my life is the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow, then all the same I have no right to it. So it's a strong view, I guess, about individual autonomy. If I have no right to it, Henry Fonda has no obligation to place his cool hand on my fevered brow, even though he knows that will save my life. And ultimately, even if he's in the same room, he doesn't have to fly over from California where he lived, but all he has to do is cross the room, place his hand on my fevered brow, and my life will be saved. I have no right to it, and I think on Thomson's view, rights and obligations go together, so he has no obligation to provide it. That's the kind of question you need to think about, I think. Do you accept a strong notion of rights? And if so, are you prepared to take it even to this point? Because if you don't, if you think that Henry Fonda does have an obligation to walk across the room and place his hand on my brow, given that he knows that that will save my life and nothing else will, then the question becomes a more nuanced one of what obligations do we have to save what kind of human beings under what circumstances. And it will get more complicated than Thompson's argument makes it.